My guest at this time is California Republican Congressman Tom McClintock. He represents the Golden State's 4th Congressional District and is a member of the House Judiciary Committee. On Wednesday, the committee held its first impeachment hearing and listened to 4 constitutional law professors give their opinions on whether President Trump ought to be impeached. By Thursday morning, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was ordering Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler to draft articles of impeachment. And Congressman, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Well, before Thanksgiving, of course, we had the series of Intelligence Committee hearings with Chairman Adam Schiff's panel. Wednesday was the first session of the Judiciary Committee and came just hours after the Intel Committee report on impeachment. So what do you make of the timing and decision of Speaker Pelosi to order articles of impeachment to be drafted today?
It reminds me of Lewis Carroll's Red Queen. Sentence first, verdict afterwards. They have been talking about impeachment since just a few days after the 2016 election. And the first calls for his impeachment came about 2 months before he even took office so that he could do anything to be impeached. For over 2 years, they were following this Russian collusion hoax, which we find out was a total fabrication from the Clinton campaign, by the way, that partisans and the intelligence and justice agencies used as justification to open a criminal investigation against Donald Trump and then leak that to the press. At first, in an attempt to influence the 2016 election and then to undermine the legitimate election of the president when they failed to affect the election itself. So this has been going on for some time. Their problem is they put all their bets on the Mueller report, which fell apart the moment it hit the light of day, and they had to come up with something else. And that's what they're doing now in a rather slapdash way, a perfectly normal diplomatic conversation between the president of the United States and the president of the Ukraine. And, you know, for them to say that there's something odd about the conversation, I mean, obviously it's not conducted in your normal diplomatic vagaries. It's Donald Trump's blunt talk. But the fact of the matter is he has the full authority to conduct our foreign affairs under our Constitution. He is commanded by that Constitution to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The National Defense Authorization Act, which actually provided funding for Ukraine, specifically requires the administration to determine that Ukraine is taking steps to combat corruption before it can release the money. When I read that transcript, that's exactly what the president was doing.
So when you look at and the big concern, of course, on the part of Democrats here is that he requested an investigation into the Bidens. Biden is a potential political opponent this year, so therefore he's asking Ukraine to interfere or meddle in this upcoming campaign. So,
well, just because Joe Biden is now a candidate for president, that doesn't shield him from scrutiny any more than Trump's candidacy shielded him from scrutiny. The difference is that the investigation into Trump was based on a dossier that the authorities knew was false. In Biden's case, there is sworn testimony by the Ukrainian prosecutor that Biden had the prosecutor that Biden had ousted, that he was fired because of his investigation into Biden's son's relationship with the corrupt company Burisma. So there was actually probable cause for the president to believe that a crime was committed by Joe Biden. It's a violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, among other things. So he's got every right to ask for the cooperation of foreign governments in looking into that.
3 professors on Wednesday were brought in by Democrats, and they, of course, argued for impeachment. They contend Trump is acting as if he's above the law, like a king or a dictator, in their words. Republicans were allowed one expert, and he argued against impeachment and even suggested Congress was actually the institution on the brink of abuse of power if it tried to impeach Trump for taking some issues to court. So what was your takeaway from Wednesday's hearing?
Oh, huge surprise. Liberal college professors don't like Donald Trump. But interestingly, one of those college professors, Jonathan Turley, who made it very clear he was not a Trump supporter, was warning that the way this is being handled will do enormous damage to the Constitution and to our institutions in coming years and perhaps even coming generations. The other 3 were just lock-stop partisans who've been calling for the president's impeachment on every pretext under the sun. In fact, one of them, 2 months after the inauguration, actually less than 2 months after the inauguration, called for Trump's impeachment because of something he didn't like in a tweet.
That's true.
So that's the quality or lack thereof of guidance that the Democrats solicited. But again, they're not interested in anything other than putting on a show to justify what they've been planning to do from day one. Don't forget, just the very day after the 2018 election gave them the majority and made Jerry Nadler chairman of Judiciary, he was already overheard plotting impeachment on the train back to Washington to get sworn in.
You were in favor of the Gray Davis recall in California back in 2003, and so some folks have wondered if there's a consistency issue there. Of course, the issue back then is ultimately the verdict was with the people, and there's a presidential election coming up in less than a year now.
The recall in California is completely different than an impeachment. An impeachment is basically the Congress nullifying the election. And the only criteria for that is very high. Treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. Emphasis on the word high. The recall, that is not an act of the legislature. That's an act of the people. And there is no criteria for the recall. You can sometimes make a mistake. And the recall is there in California to allow the voters to correct a mistake they've made. It does not empower the legislature to nullify the results of the election. That has to be held to a much higher standard.
That's a very important clarification. Now let's talk about Jerry Nadler and Nancy Pelosi, who were both previously on record fairly recently, I believe as recently as last year or even earlier this year, saying that impeachment without a bipartisan basis is a bad idea. We know from the inquiry vote that no Republicans supported that, and there's no indication that any have changed their minds on this. So what do you think changed in their minds and their estimation from their previous position on this?
I think they were hoping that they could turn public opinion so dramatically against the president that enough Republicans would grudgingly go along so that they could claim a bipartisan mandate. But their case has been so shoddy and so contrived. They've not, in fact, the only defections have gone the other way. Democrats opposing the impeachment.
Congressman, last question. What do you expect from the committee now? Do you have any idea what articles are going to specifically be drafted or what the schedule is going to look like here?
No, I think they're kind of making it up as they go along right now. But here's the interesting thing. They've suppressed a number of defense witnesses that we wanted to call. In a free society, the prosecution doesn't get to choose what witnesses the defense calls. But in the world of Jerry Nadler, Adam Schiff, and Nancy Pelosi, that's become the norm. But once it goes over to the Senate not going to stand for that. The Senate's going to require full due process rights accorded to the accused, including the right to confront your accuser, the right to call the witnesses of your choice, the right to have your counsel involved in all of the deliberations. And that means that the whole Burisma scandal is going to get laid wide open. And the brewing scandal that involves the so-called whistleblower, who we now have discovered had close ties to Joe Biden and was involved in the same cabal that was responsible for the Russian collusion hoax. So it's going to get very interesting very quickly once it goes over to the Senate, because then all of the rocks will be turned over, and I think it is going to be a rather disturbing but enlightening experience for the American people.
Well, a busy week for you, sir, and it sounds like a busy few weeks to come. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
California Republican Congressman Tom McClintock represents his state's 4th Congressional District, member of the House Judiciary Committee. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.